今天的辩论中，碳税议题显然成为了焦点，使用了比前一天多3倍的时间。这进一步凸显了碳税问题在政治舞台上的紧迫性和争议性。值得注意的是，保守党党魁在众议院发表了重要提问，强调了他们对碳税政策的强烈反对。这使得保守党在辩论中的声音更为显著，也使碳税问题成为这天辩论的核心议题。与此同时，自由党的辩论点似乎陷入了一成不变的重复之中，缺乏新的有力论据。这导致了一些议员的指责，认为自由党在辩论中未能提出实质性的回应和解决方案。这种重复的辩论模式削弱了自由党在碳税问题上的说服力，让他们显得缺乏对真实问题的深刻思考。保守党在辩论中通过多个实例强烈表达了他们对碳税政策的反对立场。首先，他们指责政府对加拿大各地不同地区实行不一致的碳税政策，强调了政府在此问题上的缺乏坚定立场。特别是他们关注到一些自由党议员明确表示，只有投票支持自由党的选民才能享受碳税豁免，而这在他们看来是对选民权益的不公平剥夺。其次，保守党在辩论中提到了碳税对家庭的实际影响，尤其是那些使用天然气取暖的家庭。他们强调了碳税的经济负担，认为这对许多加拿大家庭造成了不必要的压力。通过具体的例子，他们揭示了碳税导致能源价格上涨，损害低收入家庭的经济稳定。最终，保守党强调碳税对通货膨胀和食品价格的影响。他们指出，碳税导致能源价格上涨，从而对食品生产和供应链产生连锁效应，最终加剧了食品价格的上升。这一观点强调了碳税不仅在经济层面，还在日常生活的方方面面对加拿大公民产生了实际而直接的影响。而自由党提供的每季度碳税返现不足以覆盖加拿大家庭在碳税上多付出的部分。
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, the Prime Minister has finally admitted that he's not worth it. After how many years? Well, the carbon tax has done nothing for the environment, and it actually hampers families. Just minutes before I was going to host a big gathering in a Liberal riding to cut the carbon tax, the Prime Minister flip-flopped, but he didn't eliminate the second carbon tax that applies to Quebec with the support of the Bloc. Will be consistent and eliminate the second carbon tax for the Quebecers and all Canadians. The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to remind the Leader of the Opposition that we have been consistent, but I'd also like to remind him that today, as climate change hits Canadians and people across the planet, a party that wants to be a responsible government has to take account of climate change and help with affordability. And in terms of the Conservatives, there's nothing there. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Knew that this Prime Minister was not worth the cost. We just didn't realize he would admit it himself. But here's what it took. I was moments away from holding a massive 1,000-person rally of common sense Nova Scotians to axe the tax. The Prime Minister heard the news. He was huddled up in a ball in the fetal position, sweating bullets as Liberal MPs pounded on his office door asking for some relief. But only some relief came, Mr. Speaker, not for everyone everywhere. Will I need to hold massive axe the tax rallies in every Liberal riding to finally do away with it?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government has developed and will be rolling out a plan to deploy heat pumps, free heat pumps in Atlantic Canada and across the country. It will address affordability issues, put more money back in the pockets of Canadians, and actually help us to address climate change, something that the opposition members seem to ignore on an ongoing basis.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Admitted that he's not worth the cost by announcing that he would pause his carbon tax for some people on some fuels for some period of time. And then his Rural Affairs Minister said that other Canadians could have had the same pause, but for the fact that they didn't elect Liberals. Apparently we're going to have different tax rates in different constituencies, depending on how people vote. Why is it, Mr. Speaker, that the Liberal MPs in Thunder Bay, North Bay, Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie, other freezing cold communities are not getting the same break? Is it because their local Liberal MP is utterly useless?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Certainly it is very important that we are addressing both affordability concerns and fighting climate change across this country. The heat pump program, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, if he'd done his homework, would know applies across the country. It actually will help to ensure that we are reducing the costs of home heating, oil heating in every province and territory while continuing to address climate change in a thoughtful way.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
That is hot air in cold weather. Just today, the snow started falling in cold Ottawa. Edmonton's also cold. It has Liberal MPs. Winnipeg, they call it Winterpeg for a reason. People there are forced to pay tax on natural gas. All these cities have Liberal MPs. The Prime Minister claims that he only backed down on the carbon tax for some Canadians because of the advocacy of terrified Liberal members. So is he really saying that Liberal MPs in the areas where this pause does not apply are totally useless and will never be able to defend Canadians heating their homes?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition knows that Canadians who live in jurisdictions where the price on pollution applies get over $1,000 a year from the Government of Canada to fight climate change. When it comes to the Conservatives, they want to take that $1,000 out of the pockets of Canadians, Mr. Speaker. Our climate policy has resulted in 53 megatons being removed. That's the equivalent of 11 million cars a year. Mr. Speaker, while they keep their heads in the sand and pretend that climate change isn't real, we're going to fight climate change and we're going to help Canadians with affordability. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Foreign Affairs Minister says that if Canadians want a pause from the carbon tax, they need to elect a local Liberal MP. She's got it exactly wrong. What they need to do is elect a common-sense Conservative government that will axe the tax entirely. This is not only hurting the pocketbook of Canadians or forcing seniors to choose between eating and heating. Now, Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, and Ontario are asking for similar breaks. In fact, the Saskatchewan government is refusing to collect the tax on the utility. Does the Prime Minister realize that he is not only bankrupting Canadians and leaving them in the cold, he's actually dividing our country?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, look, as a resident of Ontario, I remember the last time that a province elected a common-sense Conservative government, Mr. Speaker. Look what they did to education. Look how they gutted healthcare. Look what happened with Walkerton, Mr. Speaker. We know as Canadians what happens when you elect common-sense Conservatives. They gut programs, they hurt Canadians, and they're certainly not there when it comes to fighting climate change or supporting Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
On home heating only benefits Canadians that live where Liberals need to save their seats. All Canadians need some relief when it comes to the cost of home heating. That's why New Democrats propose taking the GST off of all home heating. That would help all Canadians. But it's a measure that Liberals and Conservatives have both opposed. So when will the Liberals stop playing games and bring in relief for all Canadians this cold winter?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I would just say that folks in the chamber need to do their homework. This program actually applies across the country. The rebate applies, the doubling of the rural top-up applies across the country. The heat pump program applies across the country. It applies to all folks who are actually challenged by the cost right now of home heating oil.
Member for Thornhill.
Liberal NDP government is finally saying the quiet part out loud. They admitted that their carbon tax makes life more unaffordable and does nothing to help the environment. But only certain people get relief. Those who happen to live in places where Liberal polling numbers are the worst. Everyone else gets told that their vote doesn't matter and that they don't care. If the Liberals can take the carbon tax off for some Canadians, why can't they take it off for all Canadians?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said a number of times, this program applies across the country in every province and territory of this country. We have developed a solution with respect to home heating oil that will put more money back into the pockets of Canadians. It will continue to fight and reduce emissions. It will address both the climate issue and challenges with respect to affordability.
The honourable member from Thornhill.
The minister can rely on his prepared talking points all he wants, but that wasn't quite how the Minister for Rural Economic Development spun it yesterday. She told Canadians that if they wanted to be exempted from Liberal carbon taxes, they had to, wait for it, vote Liberal. My neighbours in the GTA have a question then for the minister. They have 24 Liberal MPs in Toronto, 11 in Peel, 7 in York, 10 of them are cabinet ministers. If this is the largest concentration of Liberal ridings in Canada, then why are they still paying a carbon tax?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, home heating oil is a challenge not just for Atlantic Canadians, but for many in rural Canada. That has been the case for many years, but became more forceful in the last couple of years as the price of home heating oil skyrocketed, went up 75% in 2022. What I would say is we've come up with a solution that actually will enable Canadians to do the right thing with respect to fighting climate change. We'll actually put more money in their pockets. It is a good solution for the climate. It is a good solution for the affordability of Canadians in Atlantic Canada and everywhere across this country.
The Honourable Member for Dufferin.
Has finally admitted the carbon tax makes heating your home more expensive, and he's pausing the carbon tax in Atlantic Canada. And we know why, because the Minister for Long Range Mountains said Atlantic MPs forced the Prime Minister to do it. So actually what the Prime Minister is saying after 8 years is that if you're a Liberal MP from Brampton, Toronto, Mississauga, or Thunder Bay, your voice doesn't matter at all. You can't have any change. They are effectively useless. So will the Prime Minister stop playing politics with the carbon tax and just axe it?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as a Member of Parliament from Ontario, I know that Ontario families get over $1,000 a year for fighting pollution, Mr. Speaker. I guess that Ontario MP wants to take that $1,000 right out of their pockets, Mr. Speaker. That's exactly what he's advocating for. Instead, our government is committed to making sure that we help Canadians not just fight pollution, not just fight climate change, but also deal with affordability. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dufferin-Caledon.
Now we've just been treated to the great carbon tax fable. First, it was revenue neutral. Second, you get more money than you pay into it. Third, it fights climate change. It does none of those things, Mr. Speaker. Right. What it does, and what the Prime Minister's admitted by pausing the carbon tax, is it makes it more expensive for everyone. The real tragedy is for MPs, is for Canadians outside of Atlantic Canada. Why? It's not being paused. And no, most people heat their homes in Ontario, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, BC, and Quebec, not with heating oil. It doesn't apply across the country. Will they stop playing politics, picking winners and looters, dividing Canadians, and axe the tax?
Colleagues.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to correct a record. When we came into power in 2015, projections in emission growth in Canada were going that in 2030 we would be 80 million tons above our 2005 levels. We took that out of the atmosphere, Mr. Speaker, and we've reduced emissions by another 50 million tons. That's the equivalent of removing from our roads more than 20 million vehicles, Mr. Speaker. That's one of the things that we've done in the last 8 years. We've done so many more things to fight climate change. We have the best record of all G7 countries, something that never happened, not once, under the Conservative Party for 10 years, Mr. Speaker.
Before I give the floor to the Honourable Member, I'd just like to encourage all members to wait your turn to speak until you're recognized by the Chair. The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg-en-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, last Thursday, the Prime Minister looked at the polls and panicked. And what did he do? He paused the carbon tax in Atlantic Canada. And yesterday, his Environment Minister said in an interview that he wasn't even prepared to help Canadians in his own province. And this is humiliating for Quebecers who also pay the carbon tax. Quebecers also have to eat and pay for gas. Will the Prime Minister announce the complete, not just temporary, withdrawal of the second carbon tax that applies to Quebec? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I would ask my honourable colleague to go back and listen to the show on Radio Canada, and I'm happy he does listen to it because we do fund CBC and Radio Canada. But what I said was that all the measures that we have put in place in terms of dental care, daycares, and the fight against climate change are all measures that the Conservative Party of Canada is opposed. The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg-en-Saint-Charles. Like the tax, I didn't just listen to the show once, twice, but 3 times, and that's wrong. The minister even said that as long as he will be Minister of the Environment, he will not make any other modifications to the tax in Canada. He confirmed that there will be no changes as he's in place. So what is the Prime Minister going to do with that? But right now, the Bloc is supporting the carbon tax, and they say it doesn't apply to Quebec. And at the same time, they want to radically increase it. At the end of the day, what is this government doing? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think if he listened to the show once, twice, or 3 times, he would have practiced his question once, twice, or 3 times. Yes, there is a carbon price in place across the country. And yes, we make sure that there will be a mechanism that will be fair for all Canadians, and we support Canadians in the fight against climate change, and also in terms of affordability. Honourable Member for Foothills.
It must be in the air, because the Prime Minister has announced his re-election campaign. Vote Liberal in 3 years, we're going to quadruple the carbon tax on home heating, gas and groceries. After 8 years, this Prime Minister is in a panic mode because he knows his NDP Liberal government isn't worth the cost. And now we have a Liberal minister from Long Range Mountains, Newfoundland, Labrador, admitting that only Canadians who vote Liberal will get an exemption from the carbon tax. Well, what about the Liberal minister from Edmonton Centre or the Liberal MP from Calgary Skyview? Were these MPs so incompetent and so out of touch they couldn't secure an exemption on the carbon tax for Albertans? Yeah.
The Honourable Minister.
We know that carbon pricing works. It both reduces emissions and puts more money in the pockets of middle-class families. We made a decision to attack a highly polluting source of fuel, home heating oil, in a different way so we can get rid of it faster. Mr. Speaker, we're doing this by making a record investment in heat pump technology, which is not only going to reduce emissions at a household level, it's going to save families thousands of dollars every year. This is sensible policy. It's good for the environment, it's good for the economy, and it's good for the households, not just in my riding, but right across the country.
Hear, hear.
Then I have Deputy Foothills.
The carbon tax works only if it's politically expedient. The Prime Minister's carbon tax exemption doesn't help 97% of Canadians who are already struggling to put food on the table and heat their homes. Now we have a Liberal minister from Newfoundland Labrador telling Albertans that the only reason you're not getting an exemption is you didn't vote Liberal. Wow. So is the Liberal minister from Edmonton Centre and the Calgary Liberal MP from Skyview not defending Alberta families? Were they not defending their own 81% of their constituents who rely on natural gas to heat their homes will not get a carbon tax exemption? Will these Liberal MPs from Alberta stand in this House, defend their constituents, and admit their Prime Minister is not worth the cost?
Mr. Speaker, well, I guess that member didn't hear the minister earlier when he said that home heating oil was exempted right across the country. Furthermore, for his constituents in Alberta, they're getting over $1,000 a year in a climate rebate to help fight climate change. But if that member and any other member from Alberta really wants to stand up for Canadians, why don't they stand up to Premier Danielle Smith as they're trying to gut their pensions, Mr. Speaker? On this side of the House, we're going to stand for Canadians right across this country when it comes to their pensions, when it comes to affordability, and it fights to climate change. They're reckless and they're not worth the risk. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 8 years, this desperate Prime Minister in total free fall finally admitted that his carbon tax is punishing Canadians. The Prime Minister also announced in his re-election platform that to vote Liberal in Yukon means quadrupling the carbon tax on home heating. And this weekend, the minister from Newfoundland admitted the exemption didn't apply to all Canadians across the country, including all Yukoners. My question is for the Liberal Member of Parliament for Yukon. Will he step up and stand up to this Prime Minister and demand that the carbon tax be permanently removed for all Yukoners?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said a number of times, this program and the heat pump program actually applies in every province and territory across this country. But I would also suggest that, yes, disproportionately there are more heat pumps and more heating oil in Atlantic Canada. We actually are focused on ensuring we are addressing pressing needs in every part of the country, including providing significant funding for abandoned oil and gas wells in Alberta and British Columbia.
L'honorable député de Skeena Bulkley Valley.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians right across this country are struggling with the cost of home heating, and Canadians right across this country want to be part of fighting climate change. Yet, while this government sweetened the heat pump rebate for Atlantic Canada, the rest of Canadians are stuck with a lengthy bureaucratic application process that only gets them 1/3 of that dollar amount. It does seem, Mr. Speaker, like these Liberals care more about rural Canada when they hold seats there than they do about helping everyone across this country. So will the minister stand today and commit to increasing the federal heat pump rebate for all Canadians?
L'honorable ministre.
Again, Mr. Speaker, it is important that folks actually do their homework. There is an existing heat pump program across this country that provides grants of $10,000. It actually enables people to get a check within 3 days. It applies just as much in British Columbia as it does in Newfoundland and Labrador. Last week, we announced we were increasing that by another $5,000 so long as provinces actually step up to be part of the solution. So, yes, the answer is yes.
Bill.
An obvious, desperate Prime Minister admitted his carbon tax is punishing Canadians and making life unaffordable. After 8 years, he finally proved to himself last Thursday that he's not worth the cost. And his only strategy at this point is not about climate, it's about protecting his Liberal MPs. In Sudbury-Nickel Belt, 55% of homes are heated by natural gas, yet for these struggling Canadians, they get no exemption from heating their homes. Now, the Leader of the Opposition has proposed to axe the tax in all forms of home heating for every Canadian. Will the Prime Minister agree with that?
L'honorable ministre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier, I spoke about our record in terms of greenhouse gas reduction, which no thanks to the Conservative Party, we've been able to do, Mr. Speaker, over the last few years. But let's talk about the record level number of electric vehicles that are being deployed. 10% of sales now in Canada are electric vehicles, something the Leader of the Opposition doesn't even believe in. He thinks it's a myth. Whereas 10 years ago, 1 in 25 vehicles sold in the world was electric. Today, it's 1 in 5 around the world, Mr. Speaker. We're catching up to the rest of the world, no thanks to the Conservative Party of Canada.
L'honorable député de Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 long years, this NDP Liberal government is so arrogant that it doesn't even try to hide its corruption. The Minister for Long Range Mountain openly admitted that Canadians who don't vote for Liberals will be punished with higher taxes. She insulted Canadians and gave a slap in the face to her coalition partners. What about the NDP MP for Timmins James Bay? Can the minister tell us why the NDP partners are so incompetent and ineffective they couldn't get a tax break on home heating for people suffering in Northern Ontario?
Hey, great job. L'honorable ministre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is important to address affordability. That is exactly what we are doing with the heat pump program, to ensure that people are actually saving money. It's also important that we actually are fighting climate change in a thoughtful and substantive way. I do find this question a little bit odd coming from the only member in the House of Commons who voted against the Paris Agreement.
Certain members would like to listen to the question which is being asked by the honourable member. If I could ask for your attention, the honourable member from Renfrew and Nipissing-Pembroke.
And Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister once said a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. After 8 long years, now he says some Canadians are more equal than other Canadians. The NDP Liberal government is so desperate to cling on to power, they will pay any price. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost of national unity. Will the Liberals introduce legislation today, listening to the Leader of the Opposition, and axe the tax on all home heating for all Canadians?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure how many times I need to repeat in this House that the program applies to all Canadians, all provinces and territories across the country. We are addressing a particularly acute issue with respect to home heating. Most folks in this chamber should be aware that this has been an issue for a number of years. We are doing that by accelerating the deployment of heat pumps that will save people money and will continue to help us to address climate change. That is a responsible, thoughtful way to approach public policy.
The honourable member from Dauphin Swan River, Neepawa.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. The Prime Minister finally admitted that his carbon tax is unaffordable for Canadians. But instead of removing the carbon tax for all Canadians, the Prime Minister chose to further divide this country by only helping those who voted for him. The Liberals are saying that Manitobans didn't deserve the tax relief because they didn't vote Liberal. Unfortunately, Manitoba elected 4 Liberals. Why did the Manitoba Liberal minister from St. Boniface, St. Vital fail to get a carbon tax exemption on home heating for Manitoba?
L'honorable ministre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, the member opposite clearly wasn't listening to the minister when he said that home heating oil exemptions apply right across the country. But, Mr. Speaker, what's more is that folks in Manitoba get a rebate from the price on pollution. So not only are we helping Canadians to fight climate change, which I remind my colleagues is an existential threat to our well-being, we are also helping them with the high cost of living. So instead of taking their money away, Mr. Speaker, they should be joining us in ensuring that we can all provide more supports to Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Quebec has been hit by the second carbon tax, and the consequences for the lives of our fellow citizens are catastrophic. Our food banks are overwhelmed, like Frigo Plein, Le Grenier, and L'Essentiel in my riding. 1 in 10 people use food counters and food banks. After 8 years of this government, helped by the Bloc Québécois, nothing works anymore. It costs a lot to vote Bloc. Friday's announcement by the Prime Minister is not enough. He must abolish all taxes everywhere. When will the Prime Minister finally announce his complete withdrawal of this carbon tax? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, it's always rather difficult for me to stand up after this member because for many years she was part of the first North American government that put a price on carbon. She was part of the government at the time. I would like to quote an article from La Presse this morning. In Quebec, 265 millimetres of precipitation fell, a record that had never been seen since 1940. The impact of climate change exists, especially in agriculture. It increases the cost of food. In agriculture in Quebec, $150,000 million of damages. Everyone pays for this, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Bellechasse, Les Échemins-Lévis. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Bloc Québécois-supported government, parents are simply fed up. They have to cut back on absolutely everything, including their own children's needs. I don't understand why they're laughing on the other side, because there's nothing funny in what I'm saying. One family in Lévis says they have to pay almost twice as much for food because of inflation. It's expensive to vote for the Bloc Québécois, which wants to radically increase the carbon tax. The second carbon tax is being applied in Quebec and is hurting everyone. When will the Prime Minister finally abandon his carbon tax from coast to coast to coast, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I find it hard to follow the logic of my Conservative colleague because she was there at the time when carbon pricing was initiated. She voted for it. She was part of the cabinet. So my question to my colleague is, does she just change her mind every time she changes leader or every time she changes party? The Bloc Québécois supported the Liberals once again. Mr. Speaker, close to 900,000 Quebecers go to food banks now. After 8 years of Liberal governance, that is the situation. What they want to do is create a new tax with the enthusiastic support of the Bloc Québécois, who want to radically increase the price of carbon. The Prime Minister, who is flailing in polls, says that he will give a temporary tax break for people in the Atlantic provinces. What about the rest of the country, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to tell my colleagues that there is a price on pollution. Pollution is expensive. The measures we have implemented, Mr. Speaker, will allow us to improve and accelerate our fight against climate change. We have tangible projects put forward to bring money back into the pockets of our taxpayers. Our plan is flexible, contrary to what the Conservatives have to say. They should be ashamed of their desire to pollute even more.
After 8 years, the plummeting, panicking Prime Minister admitted his carbon tax is punishing Canadians and making life more unaffordable. Liberals just announced their re-election platform, vote Liberal, and quadruple the carbon tax on home heating oil after the next election. The Liberal minister from Newfoundland admitted this exemption wasn't granted to Canadians across the country because they don't vote Liberal. Rum bottle politics is back. When will the Prime Minister stop with the Band-Aids and cure the problem he caused and axe the carbon tax?
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member asked us to cure the problem. The problem that we're trying to cure is pollution from home heating oil. Mr. Speaker, by making the investments necessary, we can replace home heating oil furnaces with heat pumps. They are cleaner, they create jobs in our communities, and they save thousands of dollars every year for families who live in my community and his. That member has described on this chamber's floor before heat pumps as fairy tale programs. Mr. Speaker, people who live in our communities are going to save $1,000. That's no fairy tale. Hear, hear.
L'honorable député de South Shore St. Margaret's.
Well, heat pumps increase the coal demanded for electricity in Nova Scotia, but NDP Liberals have brought back that rum bottle politics. Vote Liberal, get a free quart of rum, or vote and get a free heat pump. But here's the catch. Liberals promised to quadruple the carbon tax after the next election. Nova Scotians aren't fooled by this bait and switch. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost. When will the Prime Minister stop with his Band-Aid and cure the problem that he caused, which is the carbon tax, and exit?
L'honorable ministre.
Mr. Speaker, with great respect to my honourable colleague, I think he has missed the point of this program entirely. He's concerned that people will pay a higher price after the pause has ended and the price comes back into effect. If people install a heat pump, they won't pay it at all, and that is the point. Mr. Speaker, we are making the investments necessary so people can replace a more polluting system with a less polluting system. And since he's mentioned coal, we're working to eliminate that from the grid in Nova Scotia too, which is going to help people in both of our communities.
L'honorable député de Coast of Bays Central, Notre-Dame.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Folks back home are wondering how much tax they'll pay if they vote Liberal in the next election. The Liberal MP for Long Range suggested that they want to be a government that listens to the concerns of Liberal ridings. Her and her costly colleagues voted 24 times to increase the carbon tax to 61 cents per litre. After 8 years, this NDP Liberal government and this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Will they stop the mass confusion and tell Atlantic Canadians how much carbon tax they'll pay if they vote Liberal in the next election?
The Honourable Minister.
I think, Mr. Speaker, you could say it for the fifth time, and I don't think the answer would get across. The bottom line is, Mr. Speaker, we on this side of the House tried to find a way to make sure that people square affordability with wanting to fight climate change. Both are very important right now. Both are very important to people in Atlantic Canada, very important in my constituency. And I think that we have found a way to do that, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.